Humanity Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today on Raised by Survivors on hmTv. I'm your host, Bernie Fershpan, and today we are speaking about a powerful and deeply personal documentary, My Underground Mother, directed by Marisa Fox. This film follows a daughter's search for the truth about her mother, Tamar, a woman who insisted she was never a Holocaust victim, yet whose hidden past reveals a life of courage, secrecy, survival, resistance, and pain. The film has received major recognition, including Best Documentary and Best Holocaust Documentary in 2 film festivals, and has been described as riveting, remarkable, powerful, and an odyssey. Welcome to my podcast, Marisa Fox. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
You've been a filmmaker, I assume, for a period of time, a journalist as well. So before we talk about your mother's story, can you share a little bit about your own life, your career, and what led you to become someone who searches so deeply for the truth about your mom?
I'm a career journalist, primarily print journalist, but this is my first film. I grew up in a family and on the Upper West Side of New York, and with a mother who was very proud of her years in the Jewish underground in British Mandatory Palestine. And she talked about fighting on the front lines of Israel's Independence War in 1948 with Moshe Dayan. And she claimed that she was never, quote, in the Holocaust. I was a hero, never a victim. I asked her lots of questions growing up. She never could give me a straight answer, never that who, what, where, when kind of answer. So I think in a weird way, her opacity led me to pursue a career in journalism. I, like every other journalist or woman journalist, I read Joan Didion and then Oriana Fallaci in high school, and a light bulb went off. I also loved to write. I was a good writer. So it just seemed like a natural fit. And I chose Northwestern journalism for my undergrad and grad journalism degrees, and returned to New York and spent most of my career, I would say, in entertainment as well as women's service. But then switched, did a lot of music, rock and roll, magazine work, and then got involved in television. So I also do have some television production journalism under my belt, working at like MTV. In its very first year, it was a college internship, working at VH1, at FX when it first started. Journalism, I was covering music, like I said, then I became a mother, switched, couldn't go to clubs and music concerts so much at night anymore, so I switched to fashion. And it was actually covering a fashion show that when 9/11 happened, I was living downtown. I rushed to the scene and started reporting on it for the newspapers that I was supposed to write about fashion. So I kind of quickly segued and wound up writing news and fell in love with that, more hard news. And you could say like my career has not been a straight line. I think for a lot of women, juggling family and career is not so easy. And I guess I've always been the kind of person that enjoys trying new things. So I enjoy the visual medium. I did wind up going back to magazine work and worked at the Hollywood, helped launch sort of the revise of the Hollywood Reporter, worked at In Style for many years, and Billboard and places like that. And then I discovered my mother had the secret identity, and I had had a college internship at the Jerusalem Post. And once I realized I wanted to really immerse myself in Holocaust, I wound up writing, became a U.S. correspondent for Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and really became sort of their Holocaust and culture critic. At the same time that, extremism was rearing its ugly head again in this country. So I covered, Donald Trump's first campaign for president and part of his first presidency. and also wrote for the Forward and other Jewish publications, also the Daily Beast. I wound up writing a big piece about January 6th. So I guess through the years, the one through line has been covering a lot of women's issues, which sort of prepped me for the odyssey I was about to undertake.
A lot of it is reminiscent of my own, actually. Both our parents fought in 1948. They were both frontline. Both were Holocaust survivors, and they had each their own harrowing story. We both made a film about it, or both part of a film about it. It's really interesting, and I also don't see my life as a straight line as well. I had many careers, and I think that I learned this from my parents who had very little fear to try something new, especially my dad. I learned from him because he survived in a forest for 3 years. He basically taught me by his actions, watching him when he was working. He did tile work and plaster work in Manhattan. And somebody asked him to do something he's never done before, but he always said yes. He ascribed to the philosophy, fake it until you make it kind of a thing. And so he said yes to everything, but he became so good at it because he had confidence in himself. And I learned that skill from him, as I had many careers as well as yourself. I was also in the music industry. You may have reviewed perhaps some of my shows at my nightclub, the Metropolitan Room. So who knows where we crossed.
Yes.
We crossed paths in the past. Yeah. So the film that you created here begins with the idea that we may think we know about our parents until the truth actually reveals itself, something far deeper than we ever expected. What was the first moment that you realized your mother's story was not what you have been told?
I was really little, and I'm not good in math. I was never good in math, but I could count. And she told me she was born in 1935. And she said that the story she told me was that she was born in Poland, and that the family had a very big store, which was true, in the town of Sosnowiec. And her father was a Zionist, and he left shortly after she was born to go, settle the land, to basically, help create a Jewish homeland because anti-Semitism, was prevalent and Hitler was on the rise. And her mother, my mother's mother, grew up wealthy and said, I'm not going to that primitive land. You settle it, find a home, and we'll come over. And so then, as the story was told to me, my mother and her mother went to mandatory Palestine. And my grandmother said it's too dangerous here. It was the height of the Arab riots, 36, 37. And it's too primitive here. There's no, they were still draining swamps and all that kind of stuff, building roads. And she said, we're going back and, until things are calmer or more civilized. And they returned on the eve of the Nazi occupation, as the story goes. And my grandmother said, ran to a Nazi official and said, we have British passports. We need to go back to my husband. He's waiting for us. And the Nazi said, come back tomorrow. I'll see what I can do, which should have been the first tip off. It was fictitious because how many Nazis are going to be like, sure, Jewish woman, I'm going to help you out. Anyway, my grandmother returned the next day with my mother in tow, and he said, I only have room for one girl or for one seat, and it's going to go to that adorable little redhead girl over there, which was my mother. And my mother claimed that she got the last boat out of Poland to mandatory Palestine, and she never saw her mother again. And I said, well, how old were you? And she said, I was about 13. So the war, if the war broke out in 1939 and she was born in 1935, she'd be 4, not 13.
Mhm.
So I would always circle back and say, Mom, that doesn't make any sense. I also grew up going to a French school, the Lycée Français, which is another part of my crazy story. I was given the birth name of Mary Teresa, which always puzzled me. What's a Jewish girl doing with a Catholic nun's name? And anyway, long story short, I learned European geography. And so when I looked at the map of Europe, I would always say, well, what boat left from Poland? How did you get out of there? And, her answer to everything was no more questions, no more questions. So I don't know exactly how old I was when I figured it out, but I must have been about 9, maybe younger when I, looked at a map, when I started figuring out basic dates, and realizing that there were many holes in her story.
And so you carried that big question mark above your head for a very long time until you became a journalist. And how did you use your journalism skills to investigate, to follow these clues across countries and archives?
So I would say, a life in journalism teaches you how to do an interview. That said, nothing prepares you to interview a Holocaust survivor. I used to write those big cover stories for big glossy women's magazines, the celebrity cover story. That's nothing. I mean, that is okay. Yes, it takes skill to be able to pierce through that veil, through the armor of a celebrity. But it's nothing compared to the armor that a Holocaust survivor wears when they're trying to shield themselves from the trauma that they went through. So, number one skill, though, was interviewing. Number two, I would say, was also knowing how to investigate. I mean, you can't write a story about somebody. You can't begin to do investigative reporting until you can confirm proof of identity. So here I was, discovering 20 years after my mother died that the name that I knew her by was fictitious. So I had to then go to her birth town and get her birth record. But first, I had to get one of my cousins who knew to spill the beans to me. And, thankfully, before my mother died, she told me a secret about my great uncle, her uncle who lived in Israel, whose kids I'm close with. And I knew that their oldest son, Yuda, if anyone knew, he knew. And so I had to use that secret she told me about about his father to play a little, when he hesitated and wasn't going to tell me, I said, listen, I know something about your father. So if you can come clean about my mother, I'll tell you something about your father. And that's what did it. And so once I was able to get a name, I was able to go to Poland and I went to the Vital Records office. And then I was able to find her birth record, which took some doing because the clerk there was anti-Semitic and a bureaucrat left over from, Soviet Poland. And she just didn't want to give me the time of day. And to be fair to her, there was no way that I could prove that Marisa Fox Bevilacqua, my married name, was born was the daughter of Hella Hockerman, which turned out to be her real name. There was no paper trace. So I had to use all my chutzpah. I mean, to your point about fake it till you make it, I think that was the gift of having survivor parents. They had a lot of chutzpah and they survived for a reason because, part of it was luck, of course, geography, where they were. But the other piece of it was you had to push, you had to angle, you had to fake it till you make it. So, so that's what kind of powered me on was, listen, she could survive what turned out to be 4.5 years in a women's slave labor camp. I could push my way till I got all the information I needed. So I followed a paper trail. I knew how to investigate. I knew how to look in archives. I knew how to research. To this day, I over research every single article I write because I love researching. I guess it's the gift of being a journalist is also you feel like you're never quite done with school. You're always learning. So I couldn't get enough of the research. Once I found the camp she was in, and it was in this tiny town, I went to visit the archives there. And then it was this chase to find, I got the prisoners list at the camp. And then once I had the prisoners list, I had to, it turned out she wasn't the only one who had changed her name. I mean, first of all, women get married, and so they changed their last name. Also, back then, these women were born with Yiddish names, but then when they were put in this camp, a lot of them, the names were switched to sort of German or Polish names, Gentile names. But then after the war, if they got married, they went to a different country. If they came to America, they would anglicize their name or Americanize their names. So like a Blima or Basha in Poland became a Barbara, or I don't know. Sidonia became, I don't know, Sarah or whatever. Like they all had these different names. So Shoah Foundation, actually, I was very grateful for this chief indexer who sadly passed away a few years ago, Ita Gordon. May her memory be a blessing. She really like devoted so much time to this project with me, and she showed me the list of all the Gabbersdorf testimonies they had collected at the Shoah Foundation, and she had those names translated. She had the names of, if it was this Barbara or, Barbara had been Blima or Basha, that sort of thing. So she really helped me not only find people, but also understand who was who. And there were other pieces of this. I worked with a genealogist, and then, of course, that journal, this collective camp journal that became sort of the key in many ways to unlocking what it was about their experiences at this camp that turned this into sort of one of the last secrets of the Holocaust.
Without getting into too much detail, because I don't want to give away everything, I want people to watch this film. But your mom, first of all, we have so much in common. I mean, we use the same language. The word chutzpah I use a lot because I think a lot of Holocaust survivors had a lot of chutzpah afterwards because they knew what the end of the world looked like. And so they said they have nothing to lose. They've got nothing to lose. And so they pushed their way through things and became very successful on many levels. So this film that you created here, that you produced and directed, focuses on Jewish women's camps, sexual trauma, survival, and agency. Why have so many of these stories about women's experiences during the Holocaust remain so hidden for so long?
Well, I think what we have to do is look at the news today, and what's in the news every day is the Epstein files. And these poor women who survived trafficking and, you know, rape and, sexual extortion, even those who came forward in the 80s, I think the first testimonies from the Epstein files were in the 80s. They're only getting attention now. They were dismissed, they were put aside. And so the same thing happened to women in the Holocaust. Um, the few that were able to sort of, first of all, rape is one of the worst crimes. It is more than physical abuse. It is the shattering of the soul. It cuts very deep, and it is for a woman, it's the ultimate in loss of autonomy or bodily self-control. And for a man too, October 7th, there were many male victims on October 7th. So it is in the Jewish religion, we have a culture, as you know, of modesty. And, women tend to wear long, if you're Orthodox, you wear long sleeves. And for many of these women, even though there is this misconception that, everyone then was Orthodox, which was more traditional, really, there was this value of modesty. And so for a lot of these women, they had never seen even their mothers naked. So the very fact of being even made to strip naked, which is now considered a war crime, was so humiliating that they didn't want to talk about it. And also, there was a prize on virginity. And so if you were raped, and you wanted to get married after the Holocaust, why would you ever talk about that? It would sort of lower your value. What man would want to marry somebody? There was this terrible shaming of Holocaust survivors after the war, and I documented in my film how they were treated in Israel. But the truth of the matter is they were treated that way in America too, and in every country. They were treated like damaged goods. When they talked about what they went through, people didn't believe them and thought they were crazy. They were emaciated, or for some of, as the women would tell me, the moment they started eating, they put on tons of weight. Whatever the case, they had bad teeth. They had suffered through terrible hygiene, so they weren't in great shape. And so, and also everyone said, what you should do to women after the Holocaust is you need to have kids. You need to have lots of kids to make up for all the kids that were, the 1 million kids who were murdered and all the families who were lost. You have to make up for the 6 million. I mean, I was told that as a kid that I had to have at least 3 kids, which I turned out to do, but uh, to make up for the loss of 6 million. And so if you were a woman who was raped and maybe you got an STD and maybe it rendered you infertile, it was a terrible shanda. Also, if you spoke of a relative, let's say, who was killed during the Holocaust, who had been raped, it was also viewed as dishonorable. You're tainting the memory of this figure, of this character, this person in our family, beloved person. So why would you do that? And then there are other things. I mean, there's the mythologizing, the endless mythologizing about Anne Frank. Nothing against Anne Frank, but her story was not representative of most Jewish girls' experiences during the Holocaust. I mean, my mother was about the same age. Most women who survived the Holocaust didn't have the benefit of being hidden. They were taken away. They were sent to these camps. And as I learned, the further away you were from the main SS headquarters or the eye of the SS authority, the more liberties these guards took with these girls. There was nobody supervising them. It was sort of a free-for-all. They could abuse them and prey on them and extort them. Sexual barter became a thing because these girls were being starved. They were fed just the bare minimum to be able to work a full day. And, the Nazis called it death by attrition. And so, of course, there were lots of industrial accidents and illness. They were kept in these completely unsanitary conditions. And that was the point. The point was to humiliate them and to make them appear like they were subhuman and to treat them like animals. So they did what they had to do, which is why I call it sexual violence, but also sexual agency. For some women, being able to do what she had to do to secure a morsel of bread to help feed a sister, whether it was an actual blood relative or figurative, a camp sister, because they called each other Lagerschwester. They did what they had to do, and it was a point of pride, and they felt like they had some measure of control, and that was huge when you're a slave. Think about it. So I think there are many reasons why we don't know, and plus there was the pecking order of suffering in the Holocaust, the Olympics of suffering. Nothing could be worse than a death camp, right? So everybody associates the Holocaust with Auschwitz. And the truth is, the Holocaust was a lot bigger than Auschwitz. And most people who survived the Holocaust didn't survive at Auschwitz. Yet it's only Holocaust survivors from Auschwitz who bear tattoos. But we're trained to think, I thought, up until I started this, that every Holocaust survivor had a tattoo. And certainly when I started telling friends, oh my God, I can't believe it, I never knew. And they would say, well, didn't you see her number? No, these women were unmarked. So they slipped through the cracks in many ways.
They were all tattooed in their souls. Their souls were broken. I know my dad, he was a very upbeat guy because of me and my brother. He wanted us to be upbeat, to be optimistic, to be hopeful, to be successful. But deep down inside, I mean, I could see it through his eyes. There was a lot of sadness because he lost his entire family and his mother, especially, who he adored. We learn from the Holocaust, and we teach that there is a significant cost to silence, right? First of all, silence from the silent majority who don't stand up against injustice, but also the silence of those who suffered greatly, who didn't share their stories with their children and their grandchildren. And there's so many unanswered questions. So in families raised by survivors, what is the emotional cost of not knowing?
Well, I didn't have a great relationship with my mother. I adored her. I wanted to be close with her. I envied my girlfriends who had great relationships with their mothers, or at least could talk to their mothers. I could never talk to my mother. And it all happened during my teenage years or, when puberty set in. And I think it must have triggered something within her. And because she had guarded her secret, being taken away as a 13, 14 year old, never, I don't know. I think it really must have been very hard for her to watch me have a normal teenage year. I think she, in the end, um, I don't know whether she resented it, but she transmitted it in weird ways. She would open letters that I received. She was endlessly suspicious. And I don't know whether that was part of her training in the Israeli underground, intercepting letters and reading things, or whether it was what they did in the camp, where I learned that they received mail. They received mail. They received letters from home once a month. They maybe got a letter from home, which is crazy. Once again, we think we know the Holocaust, but we really don't. These camps where you could receive a letter. But all the letters were censored. They all had this Z stamp on them. And one woman showed me the letters. She still had some, and they were redacted. Lots of, talk about the Epstein files, all these black lines throughout them. So who knows what part of her story she was trying to transmit? She would listen in on phone calls. She was deeply suspicious. And I often said to my friends, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. And I don't know whether this was some way of her acting out, but it became very clear to me that she was hiding a lot about herself, and I learned to hide from her. I couldn't talk about boyfriends. She was very judgmental. There was a lot of language of shame. Um, I could never talk about the birds and the bees with her. It was really taboo turf, and she would use words like vulgar and cheap and very humiliating language, and I didn't understand where it came from. And it went way beyond the pale of being an overprotective Jewish mother. But now I know. Now I think I understand what it was. So I feel strongly that, and here she was a strong woman, you know. Um, I don't know if she had a broken soul, but it was definitely a bruised soul. I think she had felt betrayed. She fought for Israel, and Israel in the end treated survivors terribly. In those early years, it didn't really know what to do with survivors. Didn't know how to incorporate the story of the Holocaust into this rebrand of a Jewish nation that we're never going to be victims again. So, in many ways, her story is symbolic of the early years of Israel. I think she also felt betrayed by her mother who had lied to her. But because her mother died in Auschwitz, was killed in Auschwitz, I use the word killed and I don't use the word perish, which I don't think should be used when we talk about the Holocaust, because perish is what you use for a fruit gone bad, or yogurt that's been in the fridge a little bit too long. But, they were murdered. My grandmother supposedly, I'll never be able to prove it, died of typhus. Well, that's murder. That was willful neglect, willful disease, starvation, whatever. So when my mother had anger, and that got in our way too. There was the fierce love and also the fierce anger. Um, and I think about the strength of women like her. She fought in the underground. She fought on the front lines of Israel's independence war. And I think about a strong woman like Dolores Huerta, who hid until now, and she's 90 or older, until now that she had been raped by Cesar Chavez multiple times. Um, so I think it's time for us to to free women from the shame of being raped. Giselle Pellicot, the French woman who came forward with her story recently about her husband who drugged her and trafficked her to all these men while she was asleep in her bed, says it best, shame needs to change sides. And I think that my film isn't only important at a time of Holocaust denial and toxic misogyny. I mean, look at the manosphere, and it's no coincidence that the glue that holds the manosphere together is anti-Semitism. Whether it's the far left Hassan Piker and far right people like Nick Fuentes, they're both vehement anti-Semites. Um, so I think we need to, so I think my story is important for Holocaust remembrance, but also to understand how women are weapons of war, um, and women suffer from sexual violence every day, probably every minute of every day, whether in war regions or not. And it's time to remove that stigma from survivors, and so that future survivors or current survivors don't have that static, don't feel that they have to hide and become somebody else and hide such a big piece of themselves so that they can't be whole, so that they can't have good relationships with their kids or with their daughters. I mean, I have two brothers, they not interested. They had different relationships with my mother. But mothers and daughters, we have legendary relationships. We're the stuff of many movies. Um, and these relationships are precious and important. And, I wish my mother could have opened up to me in her lifetime.
This is a very important film for all of us to watch. I think that it should be shown at not only museums, but at schools, on public television. How does one access the film today?
So it's not streaming yet. However, we're still on the festival circuit, and we're beginning to play at museums. So I would love to be in your neighborhood, at your museum. Our next museum, actually, our next screening, we just opened the Barrymore Film Center Film Festival in Fort Lee, New Jersey, 2 nights ago, or it would have been Tuesday, the 26th. And we just won an award from Philly Jewish Film and Media Docs and Dialogues Festival. We won Best Film, Best Feature Film. Our next stop is the Zeckelman Holocaust Center in Detroit on June 23rd. And after that, we'll be playing in Deal, New Jersey. We'll be playing in the Berkshires. And please go check out my website. It's myundergroundmother.com, where we list all of our upcoming screenings. And you can, stay abreast and come see us. And we're also hoping for a theatrical run very shortly. So that's how you can see us for now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this vital information about this story that you uncovered. I assume that you know your mother much better now than you did, obviously, when you were much younger with all this investigation. And it's worthwhile for my listening audience to check out the website. That's myundergroundmother.com. Is that correct?
That's right.
Very good. And so see where it's playing, stay in touch with Marisa Fox, and follow up so that you can watch this incredible film that's so important today, especially today. Thank you, Marisa Fox.
We have a newsletter. You can subscribe to it also on our website, and you can also follow us on social media. My Underground Mother on Instagram and on Facebook, I have a page. And the other day, I met somebody who came to our movie in Fort Lee, and he said that he had been following me for years because I had been writing on our Facebook page every time I met another survivor. It was such an exciting moment for me. So he had been following me for about 10 years.
This is wonderful that you just shared this information with us in terms of what women went through in the Holocaust that is unspeakable, unthinkable, what they went through. And most of it has been ignored or put to the side, but you're bringing some light to it. And I hope that you continue to succeed. Congratulations on all the awards and accolades on this film. And I want to thank you so much, Marisa Fox, for joining me today on Raised by Survivors. Thank you to my listening audience as well. I'm your host, Bernie Fershpan, here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. Until next time.